The top of the hour. Sorry, I was just helping our last couple folks that were trying to chime in that were having some trouble with the links. So, my name is Justin Schilling. I'm the Member Services Manager for the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. We want to welcome everybody that's here for. We have had newly elected events in the past. We've never quite done them in a boot camp format. This particular event, when I originally conceptualized it, was hopefully going to be something that we would do during our winter conference, which we always hold um, in coincidence with the legislative session down here in Cheyenne. It's an opportunity for members from around the state to come down. We do a lot of training at the event, presentations, so on and so forth. But we also obviously encourage everybody to take some time and go over to the Capitol and harangue their legislators on your best behalf and those kinds of things as well, and get to see that process as well. But obviously, COVID had different ideas as far as us being able to do this particular event in person. So we adapted and we overcame, and here we are. Originally, we had planned on doing this event as a big one-day presentation where we try to get everybody in the same room and hopefully have all of you folks be able to meet each other and obviously make some connections and network a little bit with folks that are all in the same boat, coming together, jumping into public service all at the same time. But again, we're trying to do the best we can in the COVID age, and hopefully we still able to make those connections. We do a couple of big events a year, normally that winter conference, and then we also do a summer convention, which is our biggest event in the year. We still are in the planning process for that particular event for this summer, hopefully late in the summer, and we're working with the city of Laramie as the host city for that particular event this year. So we're really hoping, fingers crossed, that the COVID situation drastically improves from where it's at now, and vaccine levels and those kinds of things going out to where we can hold that event safely and have a good time and finally come back together in person, because it's been a long time since we could do that. So anyway, without further ado, so with each one of these programs, just to kind of give everybody a sort of a set of guideposts of how these will go. If you look at the agenda that was sent out, and is there on the event registration website, basically we've got kind of a bulk item that'll generally be a presentation of about 90 minutes right off the top. Those trainings are all going to be handled by Joe Coyne, who I'll introduce here in just a moment, kind of give you some of Joe's bio. Joe helps us out at our live events as well, does a ton of training for us, is an excellent resource for municipal folks throughout the state, and just does a really good job. And I think you guys will enjoy his presentations. He's very, he's an absolute wellspring of knowledge when it comes to all these different topics. And then the secondary topic at each one of these trainings is going to be, those will be a little bit more varied. Today, I'm going to go over what WAM is, kind of explain what our role is and how we serve the cities and towns of Wyoming, show you how to use some of the resources on the WAM website, and just kind of introduce us as an organization too, if you haven't had much exposure to us or aren't familiar with why it is that your city or town subscribes basically or is a member of our organization. So, but we'll hit that after Joe's done. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce Joe Coyne. Joe's with Joe is one of the co-founders and lead consultant for Community Builders Incorporated. He and his partner work across the state, working with different communities on different economic development projects, all kinds of different strategic plans, all kinds of different facets of municipal government stuff where you might want to bring in some extra expertise. Joe's got an incredible number of certifications, economic development with the International Economic Development Council, business counselor with the Small Business Development Center here in Wyoming, Main Street and Wyoming Main Street certified, and does a ton of volunteer service as well. And like I say, he's been an incredible resource for the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. So with that, Joe, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to see if I can take over your screen. Have you given me that ability yet?
I believe so.
And are you able to see the PowerPoint presentation now?
Let me see here. Is it showing up on your screen, Joe?
I had it open. I've gone back to your screen to see. I don't seem to have the ability to share the screen. Have you given that to me?
I'm going to, there you go. I just went ahead and gave you a hosting ability.
And are you now able to see the first page of the presentation?
Yep, you're good.
Great. I'll jump into it and get started then. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As Justin just said, my name is Joe Coyne, and I do a fair bit of the training for especially newly elected officials at WAM conferences. And because we've not been able to have those for the last year or so, this is an alternative that we came up with primarily with one purpose in mind, to make sure that folks that just got elected or folks that want a refresher course on literally the basics about being a council member or a key staff person working for a municipality. We're going to cover in the series of the next 6 weeks several topics that we consider to be core courses of material that everyone needs to understand in order to be able to effectively operate within your town or city council. And so while we're probably not going to answer all of your questions on any one given day, what we'll start with today are the roles and responsibilities and give you a broad overview of what it really means to be involved in local government leadership, in particular at the municipal level. This is a class that has been taught for many years within WAM and is part of the core courses included in their certification process. This is a great place for you to learn new information if it's new to you and to find out where to go for additional information. As Justin discussed, my business partner, Bobby Fitzhugh, and I are available to help other communities. If you've got questions or special projects that make sense for us to do, yeah, we're definitely able to help beef up your staff in a short period of time, get projects completed. But we also know that there's a bigger picture here, and so we are purposely doing these presentations at a lower rate than we would normally charge. In fact, I believe they're free to you guys, so that we can get to know what your current issues are and some of the things that you need to be addressed. And so we're listening as much as we are teaching. And so while you probably have some questions as we go through the materials, feel free to enter those into the chat on your Zoom screen, and Justin will be keeping track of those as we walk through this. Additionally, we've got time set aside at the end of the presentation to dig into things, but if you've got something urgent, then send an urgent note to Justin and he can interrupt me and we can address whatever the topics are that you're concerned about. So thanks again for joining us. What I want to do today is to talk primarily about the different roles and responsibilities of municipal officials. And this might cover more than what your new responsibility is, but it's important that you know who's supposed to do what. Where are the dividing lines between council and the mayor? Where are the dividing lines between council and staff? We think that by starting your education here, learning about those roles and responsibilities, that's the best way to help you get prepared to actually then manage your community. community, because when you boil it down, your involvement in whatever the governing entity is, your town or your city, whether you're staff or council, ultimately your goal as a community leader is to manage what's going on in your community. And so those are the two main things that we're trying to cover in today's class. And I want you to know that you should become familiar with the applicable laws in this area, and to understand, at least on a cursory basis, here's what the legal format is when we take a look at municipal governance. I will also tell you that this is a presentation that I will share with Justin, and he can send out to you guys so that you can get copies of this in PDF format, so that you don't need to take notes if you don't want to. But roughly speaking, there are three areas that you need to be looking at with regard to your legal obligations. And those start with the Wyoming Constitution. And in particular, Article 13, Section 1 talks about home rule. That's the part of the Constitution where municipalities are given, are delegated their legal responsibilities and their legal rights directly from the state. And in a nutshell, at least in theory, what home rule means is whatever authority we have at the state level, we're going to pass on to you at the municipal level so that you can then govern your community. If it were that simple, we'd probably be able to get a lot done. But what then happens is the legislature passes a series of laws that apply to all municipalities. And because these are statutes that apply to every municipality uniformly across the state, these, in a very real sense, are limits on what your home rule authority is. And there's two main sections, or titles, I should say, where you'll find those. Title 15 covers the legal description and choices at an organizational level that you make as a municipality. And then Title 16 covers more specifically what your powers are. And in particular, Chapter 4 of Title 16 covers the Municipal Fiscal Procedures Act and the Wyoming Open Meetings Law. Those two statutes have a lot to do with governing what you do on a day-to-day basis with regard to your meetings and with regard to how you handle money. So we're going to dig into those two areas a lot more. And then in addition to the Constitution and statutes, you should become familiar with what your municipal documents are. And I would encourage you at a minimum, you should know what your charter says, because when your municipality decided, yeah, we're going to incorporate, we're going to become a municipality, it's going to have some guiding choices that were made with regard to home rule in that charter. It is, in a very real essence, your own form of constitution. So it starts there, and then it gets altered over time through the ordinances that you pass. And again, over time, those ordinances collect a body of law that we know as your municipal code. And it'll be broken down into different sections. Some things that cover crime, some things that cover zoning, if you cover zoning at all in your community. And so you're going to want to become familiar with what those are, and then depending on what your interests or the topic of the day is, drill down a little bit farther. For example, if your community is talking about annexation, you're going to want to know what your code says about it. You're going to want to bounce back to the statutes because they have some very specific things to say about annexation. And then you've got the rough guidelines or the regulations in place that really guide what you can and can't decide, and some of the things that you're going to have to decide as you make decisions within that particular area of the law. So let's start with that home rule authority. And in fact, this goes back one more level to the U.S. Constitution. In the U.S. Constitution, our 10th Amendment basically says that any powers that have not been specifically claimed by the federal government are reserved to the people and to the states. And it's that 10th Amendment power that the state is then passing on to you guys as municipalities to rule your home. That is what home rule authority is in principle. And what it does is it gives you very broad authority to pick the structure, the form of the government that you want to use to be able to operate there. It also provides for you a very broad functional authority that basically says you have the power to get done what needs to be getting done to govern your local community. And at a very broad level, that is delegated to your municipality by the state to say you can do whatever is not illegal within these areas. Now, the state has also, in Wyoming, passed a number of statutes, as I said, especially in Title 15 and 16, that apply to all municipalities. And because they apply to all municipalities, those essentially are limits or hard and fast rules within which you can then exercise your broad functional authority. You also are given, with this home rule authority, fiscal responsibility and authority to determine where your revenues come from and whether you're going to borrow money or whether you're going to set rates or lower tax rates on those few areas where you are allowed to set tax rates. For example, on the number of mills that you are charging against property taxes. You have that authority because of this home rule delegation, again, that's been given to you. And then finally, you have authority to be managing your people, to manage your personnel. You get to set what those employment rules are, what the wages are, what the salary boundaries might be. You get to decide whether or not you're going to allow unions and whether you'll collectively bargain with them. Those rules are all very broadly gathered together under your personnel authority, which again ties back to the whole root of your authority, which is home rule. Now, in practice, what I'll tell you is that this home rule authority that you have is broad, but it's limited only by state laws. Within the home rule, you've got some decisions that you get to make about what kind of government you are. You can decide whether or not, for example, you want your town to be managed by an administrator, whether that's a city manager or a town administrator. You also get to decide whether or not all of your elections happen at large or whether you're going to break up your municipality into smaller wards. You get to decide, the number of council members. And again, when we get down to making decisions within topical areas, you decide, where the community is going to be going with regard to land use and who gets hired and fired, and whether or not you have a municipal court, and if so, how you staff it, and which judge you pick to administer your court duties. You get to decide issues like, what's the quality of life in this town? Are we going to do some nuisance abatement and clean up those old junk cars? And so all of your authority to do those things comes from this delegation of home rule. So one of the first decisions that you need to make is, again, steered by state statute. And by state statute, depending on your population, the first thing that you need to know is whether or not you're a town or a city. Basically, if you are incorporated in Wyoming as a municipality, everybody starts off as a town until your population exceeds 4,000 people. Mills is right on the cusp of doing that. And so as Mills approached 4,000 residents, they started thinking about what differences will this make. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit about what those differences are, because when you shift gears from being a town and become recognized as a first-class city, things like the Municipal Fiscal Act apply directly to you. You've got to step up your game and make sure you've got all of the internal controls in place and that you're administering your finances according to state statute, which says if you have more than 4,000 people, this is the way you're going to do that. And so we've got incorporated towns. Those tend to be the smaller towns under 4,000. Once you've hit 4,000, you certify that to the governor, and he starts a process where we literally change your name from town to city. And then within that, whether you're a town or city, you decide what form of government you have. The most common choice that we see is the mayor-council form of government. In fact, most towns in Wyoming have that form of government. And basically what that is where both the mayor and the council members are all elected by large, and then the mayor serves as the chief executive of that community. They also are the presiding officer of the council when you have meetings. Others have chosen a city manager form of government. There's only 3 of those, Casper, Rollins, and Laramie, and maybe you're from one of those. But in a in a city manager form of government, basically the council gets elected either in wards or at large. Casper does a mixture of that, I believe. And then they choose from amongst themselves a mayor from among the council members who serves for 2 years. That group then employs a city manager who has most of the chief executive responsibilities, and they operate the community on a day-to-day basis. The other form of government is, again, in cities or towns, you can choose to have an administrator and hire a professional, someone who's certified by the ICMA organization to manage your community for you. And in that case, some of the mayor's responsibility is delegated to that professional. Green River, Douglas, Powell, Cody, Jackson, Gillette, and Afton are all towns or cities that are operated by an administrator. And you do that, again, by your charter ordinance. When you decide what kind of government you're going to be employing under that extension of the Home Rule Authority, you make that decision there. Sometimes groups change what they're doing. The city of Sheridan has been going back and forth on this particular issue for some time, and perhaps some of you are from Sheridan looking at whether or not they would be better off with a manager or administrator, which is, I think, where they are now, is something that they continue to be talking about.
Hey, Joe.
So within, yeah, go ahead.
2 seconds. Sorry about that. We've got a couple people that are in the waiting room.
Do I need to give you authority back?
If you could, that'd be great.
Have I done it? Have I given you control, Justin? Nope, that's remote control of my screen.
Should be if you just click on my window where it's showing my video right now, and then the little 3-dot cue there should give you the option to make me host.
Indeed. And you should have that now.
Yep. Thank you.
And let me know when I can take that back. Or are you now able to see the mayor's role on your screen still?
Yep, I've got that slide, so you should be good to go, Joe.
Okay, so depending on which form of government you have, regardless of it, I should say, you're going to have a mayor. And that mayor's role can be very similar, again, regardless of the form of government you're looking at. They have different responsibilities to fulfill that include executive, legislative, presiding officer, and veto power. Now, when we talk about executive power, you need to understand that unless there's something else provided by statute, the mayor is the one who supervises all the officers, all the affairs of the city or town. They're the ones that make sure that the ordinances are complied with. The mayor is the one who administers oaths signs paperwork, signs commissions and appointments and bonds and contracts, any other obligations that need to be signed on behalf of the city or town, those are handled by the mayor in their chief executive power. They also have legislative powers. And what that means is that they're part of the council. They vote on things. They help to form what those ordinances are. And during the council meetings, they preside over the meeting. They make sure that the agenda gets followed and things like that. They also have the authority to veto any ordinance. And if they do veto an ordinance, those vetoes can be overridden by a majority vote of the council, but not involving the mayor on those votes. They also have a red line veto when it comes to looking at the budget. They have the ability to veto things that they don't like, and they can exercise that authority however they decide to issue that. Now, when you have a city manager or a city administrator, many of those executive responsibilities can be delegated to that professional. But otherwise, the mayor still remains the presiding officer of the governing body. They're still the ceremonial head, however they got chosen. They're still the ones that run the meetings and, in a very real sense, are the head of your community. Your responsibilities then as part of the governing body really fall into that, how do we manage our community? And there's 4 basic responsibilities that you're going to have as a member of that town council or city council. You guys collectively are responsible for strategy. You're responsible for the HR, the personnel management. You're responsible to manage the money and also the organization itself. Within the statutory framework that you've been given, these responsibilities are all shared by you guys as members of the city council. You don't get to say, the mayor's in charge, this is his responsibility, I'm just here for advice. This is everybody's joint responsibility to do these things. And so it's important that you understand what each of those things are, because when you boil it down, running your community really comes down to managing these 4 aspects of your job. So let's start with strategic management. And I want you to know this is a big topic. In fact, it's big enough that we do a separate class just on this topic, and we'll be covering this in one of the other boot camp episodes. But what you need to know is this is where you guys decide what your vision and mission are going to be. What is the town council going to be doing this year, or while you are there on council for your period of time? And I think it's best to think about these things on an annualized basis. Figure out, what are we going to try to get done this year? What do we need to improve? What do we need to fix? Has something been broken? Do we want to get some new projects get started? And this is also where you decide whatever it is you're going to be doing this year, how you're going to know when it's done, how you're going to know how to exercise some oversight of whatever those core services are that you provide to the community. And so understand that strategic planning isn't just a bunch of ideas. It's setting specific goals within a specific time frame that you're going to get done, and identifying the resources and the methods that you're going to follow in order to get that stuff done. And then as a manager, you're going to stay involved to make sure that those things are actually happening. You're there to help enforce accountability. And so strategic planning is a very important part of your job. Understand what it is, big picture you're going to be doing, and then also specifics where you're going to be going with it. As you do that, I'll tell you that there's lots of ways to organize a strategic plan, lots of different ways to even develop a strategic plan. One of the ways that I've used many times and I'm comfortable with is what we call a SMART strategic plan. And by SMART, what I mean is you're coming up with specific goals, measurable tasks that you can get done that will accomplish that specific goal. And you break those down into attainable chunks, things that specifically can get done and that also are relevant to getting your overall mission completed, and they're time-based. You have a time to come back and then review these things. SMART goals, when you talk about strategic planning in this way, what it does is it starts to build consensus. It gets everybody pulling together, and it helps to identify, with the very limited resources that you've got available, here's how we're going to spend those. Here's where we're going to spend our money and our time. And it makes it very clear what you're responsible for as council and what maybe staff is responsible for. I think that strategic plans should be developed first and then your budget. And then you can allocate your budget according to what you've prioritized in your strategic plan. You can then use your budget and the guidelines associated with that to then monitor throughout the year. Are we getting things done? Are we over budget? Are we on time? Are things happening as we expected? And armed with that kind of information, you can keep your constituents informed. You can communicate with them, here's what our overall plan is, and here's the progress that we've made with this during this fiscal year. Here's what we hope to do next year. And that's how you get some buy-in from your community by showing them, we're going to hold ourselves accountable to you. We're going to evaluate how we're doing our job, and we invite you to do that with us so that we all understand what it is we're doing, and we hold ourselves as public servants accountable for the outcomes that we are trying to achieve here. One of your other management responsibilities is HR. And frankly, this is something that scares the daylights out of lots of council members. So don't think that you're alone in wondering, gosh, I don't know how to do this. I'll tell you what, it doesn't have to be as hard as many have made it. There are statutes that apply here as to which employees that you can appoint, which ones you can remove, which ones are solely under the responsibility of the mayor, and which ones the mayor must come to you for advice about if you're a council member. This is where you can talk about how long you want those people to be in their position and what you want them to be paid. I would encourage you to get your hands dirty and dig into looking at whatever the job descriptions are for the various staff positions that you have and understand what your folks are doing. Volunteer to help rewrite those job descriptions so that they're accurate, so that you can say, these are the things that we're going to hold you accountable for, and these are the things that you should be doing. And as you do that, there will be times when you're going to want to go back and look at your HR policies and review and revise those. Things are happening all the time on HR issues. In particular, this year we've seen a Supreme Court case or two have an impact on things like workplace harassment. And so you may want to go back in and make sure that your explanation of sexual harassment includes now sexual orientation and gender. That kind of harassment is not allowed according to the Supreme Court. And so you may want to go in and revise your policy to be consistent with that. Additionally, understand too that your role here is management of the overall process and the policies here. Generally, as a council member, you're not going to have any responsibility for day-to-day management of anyone. That's the mayor's job. Unless you're in one of those forms of government where you have a city administrator or a town manager, those kinds of things, the mayor is responsible for these positions. If you've got an administrator or a city manager working there, it's their job to do the day-to-day management. Your responsibility on council is still associated with overall HR management, making sure that the policies and the broad guidelines are in place, but your administrator is the one that's responsible for managing all of those matters on a day-to-day basis. Your hire and fire authority is going to be limited just to that one person. Otherwise, this is the mayor's job. The mayor is the one that gets to appoint, with your advice, the department heads, and they've got direct control over those department heads, hiring and firing them. Beyond that department head, they allocate that authority down, and so you do have big picture responsibilities here, but not involvement in the day-to-day stuff. You're also going to be needing to recognize that along with people, you're managing specific services and programs. And by law, many of these are outlined according to statute. You know, you have responsibility for city streets and sidewalks, for all of the public spaces, the public parks, police and fire protection, the overall health, safety, and welfare of the community. You guys probably control your wastewater treatment programs, your water itself. If you've got any kind of mass transit or public transportation or airports or golf courses, you need to manage those things. And you'll learn later that those things essentially need to be managed largely as independent accounts. Where you're not borrowing revenue from one to pay down another, but rather they need to stand on their own as enterprise funds as far as what it is you're managing. And so start thinking about the specific programs that your community provides and understand you need to understand them from top to bottom in order to figure out, you know, what do we need to be doing from a budget perspective? How do we manage as council members these programs that have been in place for years, or do they just go on autopilot? I'll warn you, nothing goes on autopilot very well, not for very long. And so you're going to want to become familiar with what these services and programs in your community really are. Financial management is another one of those broad areas of responsibility that you have. In fact, it's so broad, we teach a couple of different classes on this. We teach, for example, a class just on the expenditures and revenue, how you actually manage the money that's coming in and going out your door. But there's another class that we teach, and again, both of these will be provided in the boot camp over the next few weeks. We'll also talk about how you set up your budget, how you forecast financial revenues, which is increasingly a big problem for all municipalities, not just in Wyoming, but everywhere. As someone who's on council or involved in making sure council is ready, council's responsible here to set that fiscal budget. And there are very specific statutes that provide when and how you determine what's going to be included in that budget. You as council help to establish what the investment policy is and how you're going to be managing both staff and money by putting into place, you know, internal controls. These are the things that need to be in place, the checks and balances that need to be in place to make sure, you know, money gets spent responsibly. Those are the things that auditors look for when they come in to audit your community. They're not just looking to make sure that the numbers add up. They're looking to make sure that you've got trained staff that are taking on meaty responsibilities here, and that those responsibilities are reflected in the checks and balances that you've put in place to protect the public funds that are out there. And those are also called internal controls. And so an audit process looks not just to make sure that the accounts have the money in them that we say have in them, but they make sure that these internal controls, these processes for making sure that money gets handled appropriately, those are in place. Now that takes a long conversation, and we'll cover that in another class, but as a top-level management tool, you need to know what those internal controls are, and you need to be on top of an audit to make sure that you're engaged with it, and that if there are findings, you know what you've got to fix following that audit. And so be alert for those other financial management core classes that will be coming up over the next couple of weeks through this boot camp. One way that you can become familiar with these things before those other classes are to take a look at least two of the manuals that are out there that, frankly, the state has said, thou shalt do it this way. And that's the correct way to think about the Wyoming Municipal Handbook and the Wyoming Government Entity Budgeting, Accounting, and Reporting Manual. Both of these manuals in their current form can be obtained on the state auditor's office. I've put the URL on this page. If you go to public funds or just simply search Wyoming State Auditor Manuals, it'll take you to this page. Download them. You should at least get familiar with the table of contents and flip through these. If there are areas that you know are coming up, you should refer back to these for guidance before you go to meetings, before you even go to the training, so that you are roughly familiar with what these things are and maybe can come prepared with questions if it's a meeting for your staff, or questions of me if it's a training. And so get familiar with these two main publications. If you are a municipality with a population of more than 4,000 people, if you're a city, or in the example of Mills becoming a city, the publication here on the left, the Wyoming Governmental Entity Budgeting, is a requirement for you. Towns that are under the population of 4,000 simply need to follow through, for example, a budget form that the Department of Audit pre-approves. But everybody else needs to follow a higher level of accounting with these internal controls built right in to their fiscal process. And so the more you're familiar with them, the more likely you are to be comfortable with those internal controls. And believe it or not, even if you're a town of 100 people, that's the direction to be going in. That's the correct way to handle fiscal matters, is to do it the way the state outlined us to do that. Everybody, though, also should become familiar with the Wyoming Municipal Handbook. It defines, for example, what you can do not just with your budget, but with some of the investment funds, what you can and can't do. It provides a lot of information for you. The organizational management responsibilities you have, the fourth area of broad management responsibility you have, really talks about how you're going to be managing the organization itself. And if you're on council, I especially want you to make a commitment to yourself and to your fellow council people, to your whole community, that you won't just attend council meetings. It's embarrassing to staff and to the public when you show up at council unprepared and everybody can see that you're thumbing through the notebook for the first time. Every single council that I'm familiar with provides an agenda in advance, and oftentimes they provide what they call a council packet, and that packet's going to give you information that's going to fill in your knowledge that's needed to follow along intelligently with that board agenda. It'll have the background information. It'll have, for example, the warrants that you're going to be needing to provide approval for. Take a look at these things ahead of time. Prepare and think about what it is you're going to be called upon to do at your council meeting and get involved. To me, many community leaders, do a great job being an advocate for your community, and you need to do that as well. But the best way to do that is to, first of all, fulfill your responsibility, either as staff or as council or as mayor, and show up to these meetings. You should be working together as council to solve the problems within your organization. And so if the group wants to get together to do some strategic planning, or to just simply get to know one another a bit more, do those things. It's important that you be able to function as a group using principles of mutual respect, that you can get along with one another, and that you've got an idea of how you're going to manage, from council meeting to council meeting. What nights are you going to meet? Are we going to get together when it's convenient for everybody, or are we going to try to do it the way they've used to have done these things? So talk to your fellow council members and be recognizing that the stronger you can become as an organization, the more effective your governance is going to be. To do that, I think it's important to be talking about what you guys want to do for a long-range plan. Where are you taking the community? Has it been well run for the last several years? You've got a well-oiled machine, and you simply want to continue what has been working right. You want to make sure that you strengthen your staff's ability to get their job done and keep good staff. You want to make sure that as council members, you're getting more involved and more knowledgeable about what it takes to manage your council. And that probably means getting more involved in WAM and more important, getting involved with your peers, developing relationships with members and staff members from other communities is one of the biggest advantages to, I think, going to WAM conferences. And doing things with your peers allows you to share notes and share ideas long before you're at a council decision-making session. Get involved in writing job descriptions for your appointed employees. Get involved with talking to them on their maybe just their section or their department, how they're going to be getting things done. It's okay to work with people. You don't get to be their boss, a Lone Ranger kind of thing, but get to know who those employees are. Your key staff people can make you look great, or they can, keep their mouths shut and let you be the fool that you want to be if you don't want to listen to the knowledge that they can share. So my approach to for council and working with staff is, set those broad goals and then monitor and make sure that you're evaluating the goals in such a way that you can give some feedback, not just you're behind schedule, Joe, but hey, I can see that this is something that isn't getting done. Is there something I can help with, or do we need to revisit that part in the plan? I encourage you to trust your coworkers, your co-council members, and to trust staff, but verify that what they're telling you and what these financial statements are showing you, verify that that is in fact the truth. Your job ultimately is going to be the place where the buck stops. And so monitor what's going on, evaluate what's going on from the point of knowledge. That allows you to trust people and to be able to then go in and verify that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. To do that, you, again, need to be prepared. So when you get reports, financial statements, take a look at them. Understand what they are telling you. A typical financial statement, for example, says, here's where we are, as a matter of fact, in our actual expenses, and here's where we thought we would be according to our budget. And when there's a big difference, ask why. Take a look at program reports so that you can determine whether or not folks have been succeeding or failing. And regardless of whether it's a success or a failure, you should understand there's a reason why. Why did we get it this time right but not last time? And to do that, it's okay to ask for information from staff and from other council members so that you can get your job done. You do have responsibilities for oversight here, and so it's okay to ask for additional information. You should already be getting monthly financial statements, or some communities I know still do quarterly monthly statements. Whatever your community is doing, understand that that's a window directly into your ability to manage the finances of the organization. And likewise, you can be asking for similar reports about where are we on our strategic plan or on your department's goals for this year. Those are the kinds of things that you should be talking to staff and council members about. And to do that, you've got to be prepared. Do that before your council meeting. Again, make yourself look smart, make yourself look prepared by doing that. Keep yourself prepared and informed. Some guidelines that I would give elected officials, and I'll give some also for key staff members here in just a moment, but as a council member, understand that the real strength of the council is its team approach. Not any one of you, but rather what the entire council has decided. And so everyone on council should have an equal voice, each have an equal vote. Treat one another with the mutual respect that I know you would want people to treat you for. And again, that includes being prepared for meetings, and then during the meetings, treat one another, with courtesy. That's where mutual respect shows itself. You can refrain from any personal opinions that you might have, especially if they are derogatory remarks or simply being rude, and instead work towards decisions that reflect a consensus, because ultimately when it's all done and said, whether the vote was 5-0 or 3-2, you should be working towards consensus so that when you walk out of that meeting, everybody's on the same page. You might not have agreed with the final decision, but as a team, this is what we're going to do. And that means you're going to have to be okay with losing some of those fights. And so instead of seeing everything as an all or nothing proposition, be working toward consensus. And if it's clear that you're not going to get everything that you want, be willing to negotiate. That's what good governance is all about. Understanding what the other person's looking for and being able to appreciate that in a form that you're willing to give up some of what you had outlined simply because you are working toward that consensus. That's an art, and I don't think it can be taught. It starts, if anything, with mutual respect. And to me, that means really listening to what other people are saying. And to listen to somebody and understand where they're coming from, to understand their perspective is often what it takes to show that mutual respect and to reach a point of consensus. You can't guess. You can't assume the worst about people or even the best about people. Listen to what they're saying. Watch where their feet are really going and be as prepared as possible to solve whatever that problem might be. On the flip
Joe,
side of that, yeah, go ahead.
One quick question from the chat. Brad from Mills asked, should council be involved in department head meetings?
I would suggest that it might be okay for that to happen. I would suggest that having council involved with a department head can be an intimidating exercise, but I'm also familiar with a number of councils that have allocated to individual council members responsibility to become knowledgeable about a particular department. And they share that responsibility that way. So maybe you assign somebody to oversee the police department and somebody else oversees, public works. That's very common. And so it would be okay in that instance for them to be directly involved. And I think that's especially the case in small towns or in communities where there just simply isn't enough staff to get things done. It's helpful to have a department head and a council person together talk about things and talk things through. If the department head is having to then actually go out and do everything, I think it's especially important that they talk. Two heads are better than one, but that it not be allowed to slip into a position where suddenly that council member is the department head's boss. It should never work that way. If there's a boss, it's the mayor, not the council. And so when individual council members are assigned to specific departments, the risk they take is becoming a lone ranger, and that's never an appropriate role. Instead, you should think of council as a group having authority to tell departments what to do, preferably through the mayor. But to do planning, to make sure that we're staying on top of what's going on from a knowledge perspective, there is value in having council and department heads meet and talk about real issues. Okay, from the same perspective, the staff has certain roles to fulfill here too. They're not council. They're not the ones that set the long-term strategy. They might be coming to council and providing advice, and hopefully that comes in the form of recommendations as to what to do, but their job is to implement the final decisions made by council, not to make those decisions themselves. And so they're the ones that need to realign their priorities to match up with what the governing body's goals have been for that year. That's why these folks are elected leaders. They're in charge. And when council says, here's the direction that we're going to be going in, and we're looking for recommendations and changes from staff to align with this strategic plan, that's what we're talking about. Staff is the one that goes out then and makes it so. And so while they're supervised by the council as a unit, and while, as Mills was suggesting, it is appropriate to have specific council be assigned to particular departments because nobody can be a master of every department, understand that that doesn't mean that council member is now supervising that particular department. It still needs to be done as a group council executed by the chief executive, which is going to be the mayor, or if you have an administrator or manager, it'll be executed by them. And so council's only strength is as a group here. Staff needs to recognize that, But council needs to recognize that staff can really help them here. And it's not just department heads. The key staff for most small towns is actually your clerk and or your treasurer. Sometimes they're combined into one person. That person has an awful lot of statutory responsibility on their shoulders. They're the busy people that are actually oftentimes managing the operations of your town on a day-to-day basis. Unless you've got a city administrator or a town administrator or city manager in place, the clerk treasurer does an awful lot of the work. They're the ones answering the phones all day. They're the ones that are engaged with making decisions and oftentimes talking to the mayor on a daily basis. And so frequently you see a very strong relationship between mayors and their clerk treasurer positions, but not always. Sometimes they can conflict. Understand that this is where we do want council to be involved, to be aware of what these people know and what these folks have learned in their roles in getting things done. These are oftentimes the most talented, educated people that are working for your city or your town. And so make sure, council members, that you're talking to them, and staff, make sure that you understand you're not the boss, council is. And so we want to make sure that we've got a good working relationship and understand the very bright line between management and getting things done. So council should be expecting staff to manage those day-to-day affairs, to give them advice, and to not do so in any sort of a sarcastic or passive-aggressive manner, but professionally. What's best for our community? And you can expect that from your clerk and treasurer every time. You should be getting professional input from them. And they should be making recommendations to you from a policy level. And then council, once you have adopted a policy, it is up to staff to then implement that policy, to communicate it to their own staff if they've got other staff members, to explain it even to you if you're having trouble getting your head around policy. At the detailed level, this is what staff can do. They should understand how these things actually work. You're going to find as council that you are very reliant on staff to help develop a budget. So you can ask them, for example, what have we spent for the last few years by department, and they can help put that together for you so that you can see what the trends have been. You're going to need, staff to help recruit personnel, to help place ads and to help you organize interviews and to supervise the other staff and to simply just keep the doors open, keep the operations going on a day-to-day basis. Many times, if you're in a small community, your clerk treasurer is the public face of your municipality, and so they're the ones that are out there upholding the public image. Don't leave them dangling. Give them your back. Give them your full backing. Give them your support and let them know that you support what they're doing. And if you don't, then speak up to them privately. Never, ever speak critically of one of your employees in public. It should always be done appropriately through the mayor in private, never public. Flip side of that is, understand what your staff expects of you, council. They want you to be advising them, to be counseling them on what they're looking for. Don't send staff off on a wild goose chase trying to hunt something down. If you've got an idea of what you're looking for, let them know and tell them, here's what we want to do. We want to do it like Green River did it, or we want to do it like Chugwater did it, or whatever that is. They also don't want to be talked down to. Consult with them. And where it's appropriate, delegate responsibility to your staff. They're the ones that are actually able to get things done. Just clarify what it is you want done and do that by communicating openly with them and then supporting them in getting their things done. But you need to understand that the decisions that you make are not made in a vacuum, council. You need to hold yourself and them accountable together, so that when things go wrong, you don't throw anybody under the bus. You recognize that as a group, we made mistakes here. What can we learn from them? Let's dust ourselves off and get back up and get back into this and fix the problems. That's why we need to stay involved. That's why we need to continually evaluate what's going on from a public policy perspective, as well as what's going on from city council. And so understand that these are responsibilities that cut both ways. You can't just expect staff to operate in a vacuum, and you don't get to operate as council as a vacuum either. It takes a relationship between the full council and your key staff. I honestly believe nothing gets done in municipalities or any business corporation that I've been involved with without staff. Boards don't get a lot done. Staff does. So understand that, and understand that the relationship between council and staff is as a group. No individual council member has authority over any staff, over any individual person. Your job as council is to define that big target, the long-term target, the long-term goals that you want to be going towards. Identify what you will and won't support in terms of getting it done, and then celebrate every success. What Bobby, my business partner, used to tell her staff when she was the city administrator at the city of Douglas was, don't break any laws, don't do anything unethical, but beyond that, get the job done. And let me know if you need more support. If you need more financial resources or more staff, understand that things are tight, but I'll do what I can. Make your case, staff. If you feel that you need something from council, make your case and encourage them to understand your position. If we're going to get this done, I must have an administrative assistant, or I must have, another snowplow driver, or whatever that might be. You've got to make your case to them. And so let them know that you need their support for new positions or for new resources or whatever that might be. But when they tell you to get something done, keep your eye on the target yourself and make sure that you are using all of your resources to get that thing done. So what we're really talking about here, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question from Sherry. She wrote, how many council members can you have communicate together about an issue without overstepping Robert's rules? I think this one's probably on, this might be an open meetings type question.
It is. Yes, it's a great question, and I'll get to it in just a moment. But yes, if there's a quorum, then you're looking at a meeting. So if you're going to have more than 3 council members and you've got a total of 5, you're dangerously close to a quorum. I'll cover that more in just a couple more slides here. Your conduct then between staff and council, I think, needs to be based solidly on mutual respect. Cooperate with one another as professionals. When you've got questions, it's important to, as council member, that if you've got questions, you direct those to the boss in the room, not to individual staff members. You've got to remember the chain of command. And while council is certainly at the top of that chain of command, and council should be addressed by people speaking directly to the mayor, in the same way, council, when you talk to or about a particular department person, remember, you should be directing your comments through that department head or through the clerk treasurer, whoever's in charge of that staff member. You should never publicly criticize any individual employee, whether they're a key employee, the city administrator, or not. If you're going to fire that person, go into executive session, talk about what you need to talk about, come out and pass a motion to fire that administrator. Don't do this publicly. It's a personnel matter, and you only expose yourself to both legal liability and shame for doing something like that. So all of your conduct should be based on these principles of mutual respect and treat one another as professionals. Likewise, you're going to have opportunities to interact not just with staff, but with boards and commissions. These are typically groups that you've appointed, the people that sit on that commission, whether it's a planning commission or maybe a Main Street commission or a historic preservation commission. There's lots of different commissions and boards out there. And as council members, you're going to be appointing members to those boards. They, in a very real sense, work for council. But understand too that when you set up a board or commission, you're delegating to them a chunk of responsibility that typically is within one subject area. And maybe it is planning and zoning. They tend to be some of the most controversial boards. You need to trust them to develop expertise within that planning and zoning arena. And when you delegate to them, it is typically should be something at a very high level. And so if you show up at a planning commission meeting or some other board or commission meeting, I want you to understand that your presence there is going to be very intimidating. It might stifle some conversation. It might even prevent people in the audience from speaking up to the point where they don't think you've really delegated anything to the commission. Instead, that you're maintaining a heavy hand of control over that board or commission. And so I would suggest that in the same way that you should limit your contact with staff, you should also limit your contact with board members of any commission. You know, sometimes they'll specifically ask you to come in. And in particular, that might be as they're talking about final approval, say, of a master community development plan, because that's the point when they can articulate to you what they want to be in there. But keep it limited. You know, you want to be able to trust these board members, and so when you do talk to them, I would suggest that you simply ask questions, clarification questions, that you not be lobbying for any particular position on whatever the issue might be. In fact, if you do come to a planning commission and you lobby them to approve a project that your construction company is working on, that certainly looks heavy-handed. It certainly looks like a conflict of interest, and it probably is. These people, even though you've appointed them, serve the community, not individual council members. And so be careful in your conduct with the public. Be careful in your conduct with any board or commission. This is something that you want to respect, not be heavy-handed about. Likewise, when you talk to members of the public, especially if you are in a public meeting, my suggestion is treat them with respect and care. Listen to what they are truly saying. And active listening requires that you maintain eye contact with them, that you interact with them for clarification, not for debate. When you hold a public hearing, you should be opening up the floor for people to say what they think. That's not the time for council to be speaking. It's not the time to be having a debate or arguing with somebody. Instead, treat it with appropriate levels of decorum. The mayor should be running these meetings, or if he's not there, he should delegate someone to run these meetings, to be the presiding officer over them. And that person is the one that should control the dialogue. All comments from the floor or from council should be directed through the presiding officer, through the mayor. And it's the mayor then who should be, recognizing speakers and setting up and maintaining, a 5-minute limit if that's what you have put on the conversation for the night. Watch what people are doing and pay attention to the whole room. You'll see body language. You're there, if you're there to listen to the public, listen to everybody that's there, because lots of people speak without even having to say a word. Pay attention to what they're doing, what they applaud and what they boo. Don't allow the decorum to get to the point where you've lost control of it. But you also need to recognize when you're talking with the public, right then and there is not the time to make a commitment. You cannot respond immediately to any speaker and make a promise to them on behalf of the council. You need to recognize that council acts through votes, and public hearings are not the time for votes. Public hearings are for the public to be heard. And so when you are interacting with the public, or you've got people just sharing their thoughts, that's the time to take notes. That's the time to pay attention and make sure that you understand what they're saying. And if you don't understand, then it is okay to ask for clarifying comments, but treat them with respect. And similarly, treat the media with respect. You need to understand that the press, very broadly speaking, is the public. They have a right to talk to you. But when you talk to a reporter, understand that there's a couple of people that you're talking to. You're talking to this immediate person, yes, but understand they've got a broader audience, and you want to make sure that your comments are framed so that that broader audience, the public, understands what it is you are actually saying. And so choose your words carefully when you talk to the press, when you speak at a public meeting. Anything that you say can and will be used against you. Think about it. So anytime that you interact with the media, it should be cordial. It should be polite. It should be a recognition that they have a right as a member of the public and as someone who reports on your municipality, they have a right to report these things. They are a member of the public, and so they are the eyes and ears of what the people are going to say. So one of the things, especially if you're newly elected, is to reach an understanding with the rest of council. How are we going to do this? Do we funnel everything through the mayor, or are we going to have a council where any of us can talk to the newspaper, the local newspaper at any time? Are we going to have an official spokesman? And will that be the mayor, or will it be the clerk treasurer? Or will it change based on whatever the topic of the day might be? I'll also tell you that you should never go off the record with the media. There really is no such thing. That is a guideline that some choose to follow, some choose not to. So be very careful with these off-the-record statements. That is not a way for a member of a council or a mayor to be speaking to these folks. You cannot trust that it is going to stay off the record. They can use that against you. You're depending completely on that reporter's promise to you to not use it. So be careful with that and be respectful.
Hey,
Now,
Joe,
getting around, yeah, go ahead.
quick question from Eric from Gillette. Does the person talking need to give their address? So in the context of a council meeting, when somebody steps to the lectern, and a lot of times you'll hear them, give their name and their address. Is there anything that's formally required, or is that just a council by council?
I believe that the only requirement is that they identify identify their name and their affiliation. I think they can simply say, I'm Joe Coyne, I'm a resident. I don't think they have to give their address unless that's relevant in that case. If you're talking about, for example, a zoning exception, and they need to identify themselves as someone that lives in that neighborhood, then they should do so. Beyond that, you can't require folks to give up much more than that. If they're going to address the chair, though, it is okay to ask them for their name. What I've typically asked for is their name and affiliation. In other words, why are you speaking on this? Are you a local business owner? Are you, a nonprofit? Are you from out of town? It's okay to ask those kind of questions to understand the perspective that someone might be bringing. All right, council meeting protocol. Again, this is something that as newly elected folks you want to ask about. All councils need to have some form of protocol that they're going to follow to run the meetings. And a lot of you are familiar with Robert's Rules of Order. That's probably the best known, commonly used protocol that's out there. But there are others out there. The key thing is to understand which one you're going to follow and then make sure someone's actually following it. I've frequently referred to that person as a parliamentarian. Mayors can appoint a parliamentarian. They can do it themselves, or they can ask someone who may be especially knowledgeable about Robert's Rules of Order to be that parliamentarian if that's the protocol that they adopt. It's revised on a regular basis. It changes, but in its basic form, what we're basically talking about is just a commonly accepted rules of order that allow decorum to take place, that require that we follow the agenda, that we have a presiding officer in charge who recognizes or does not recognize folks. They control who is speaking, they control what they're speaking about. That's the basic principle of any protocol. How that gets interrupted or how you go about choosing to pass motions and pass ordinances, all of that stuff falls into place much more neatly if you do have something like Robert's Rules of Order in place. The other thing that goes along with that is to recognize that you can put, as a mayor, you can choose, who the chair of, your public works conversation is going to be, and you can have a council person report out on that particular thing. You can, have your chairman of a board run the meeting and as the presiding officer. Whatever the meeting is, I would encourage you to refer to one another with your formal titles. It's a lot more professional to be talking about a meeting referring to Councilman Jones versus my friend Bill. So use your formal titles, whether it's mayor or council person or councilman or councilwoman, whatever you decide works for you, use those formal titles. And when you've got someone from the public speaking, again, if you're on council, frame your questions through the mayor, but refer to that person as Mr. or Miss or whatever their title might be, so that you are demonstrating, at least for your part, that you're going to be respectful. You each have a role to set in the tone of these meetings. Additionally, along with this on an ongoing basis, you as council need to figure out how we're going to set the agenda. Oftentimes what happens is you have like an agenda template that you use from week to week, and you have a key staff person or the mayor tweak it for each meeting to identify, here's what we need to be talking about. A lot of times that agenda will have things on it that, there is no new business, or there are, there's nothing to talk about in this particular agenda item. Or sometimes people just want to raise new issues and they're not on the agenda. You need to talk about these things ahead of time. And your mayor needs to know how we're going to deal with those non-agenda items. Do we just put them all at the end and maybe we explore them one at a time long enough to figure out whether it's a quick decision or something that needs to be tabled until our next meeting and do some more work? Talk about how you're going to work through your agenda, how you're going to handle members of the public coming in. Will you allow them to talk on each item, or are you going to say, no, this is our time and we're just going to have public comment at the end or at the very beginning, or maybe however you want to do that. Talk about those things ahead of time. Likewise, for even public hearings, you should frame that conversation in such a way that, we're going to talk about this particular issue today, and at today's public hearing, I can see there's 50 people in the room. We're not going to get to everybody with unlimited time, and so to make sure that everybody does get a chance to speak, I'm going to listen to everybody for the next 2 hours and limit everybody to a 3-minute talking span. Please get in line so that we can move quickly. And I'm going to listen maybe to all of the arguments for the proposition, and then we're going to listen to all of the arguments against the hearing. Likewise, for executive sessions, you want to know how you're going to go about doing those. And I'll share some more about executive sessions in just a moment. But my point is, years ago, I stopped going to any meeting, unless I know there's an agenda. And if I've been to your meeting and I can tell that you're not going to follow your agenda, I'm not going to be back for a second one. And that's completely unacceptable for any council meeting, but in particular, executive sessions. You don't go into executive session for just some random reason. You need to have specific reasons for these things. And so understand that any kind of meeting that you're having should be based on some level of decorum. Somebody should be in charge for moving through that agenda, and that agenda should be clear as to how we agree on it. I've given you here a sample agenda outline that you can maybe start with for how you want to organize your council meetings. Most of you are going to inherit a similar kind of agenda outline from your predecessor. They don't all have to follow the same format. You've got some flexibility here, but you also need to recognize there are things that every time council gets together, you should be going through an opening ceremony. That's part of setting the appropriate decorum. You should be doing a roll call to determine whether or not you have a quorum. You should look at the agenda to make sure that there's consensus on what we're going to talk about tonight. You should always be reading through and approving the minutes from your previous meeting. I feel that you should always have a door open for public comments, and if you've got an issue that statute requires that you hold a public hearing on, something like a zoning change, then those should be on this agenda. Likewise, if you've got specific ordinances that are under consideration, or a contract coming up for renewal, or a license for a local bar coming up for renewal, put those on your agenda. You should be getting regular reports from your department heads, and if you've got boards or committees that have work going on, put that on this agenda so that they know when and where they're going to be called upon to share with you whatever that topic of the day is. I like to post these agendas as much as possible online or on your front door so that people know what you're going to be talking about ahead of time. You can also have them published. Publishing has become a big issue, a bigger issue maybe with the current legislature. I'll talk about that again in just a moment. So if you've got a protocol in place, if you've got agendas in place for how you're going to be doing your meetings, the next thing to think about then is the importance of that presiding official. And regardless of what type of community you have, what form of government your municipality is run by, the mayor presides over those meetings. Whether you've got a city manager or not, whether there's an administrator or not, the mayor presides over council meetings. And so they're the person that sets the tone. They're the ones that call the meeting to order, and then I hopefully will lead a Pledge of Allegiance or whatever ceremony you go through to start your meeting. Their responsibility then is to follow that agenda. It's their job to maintain some discipline in that room, to tell the audience how they should be acting and remind them that you're not going to tolerate, applause while people are talking. Those things are disruptive, and particularly while speakers are still speaking, you do not want to allow anyone to be interrupting them, whether it's applause or booing or any kind of other remarks. So the other thing that is maybe a limit for presiding officers is that you don't get to make motions. Those motions to get things done on your council need to come from a council member. You can call for them if you're a mayor. You can let people know, I would now entertain a motion to approve the minutes, and maybe you have someone say so moved in a second and you get it done. But no, you don't actually make motions as the presiding officer. You can simply call for them, and as I've often done when I've been a presiding officer, when I call on them, I let people know exactly what I'm looking for in terms of a motion. So council members then get to vote on those things. Here, the mayor does have both a right and a responsibility to vote. Council members do vote, and they should be voting on everything. But as you consider your role as a council member, understand that everybody else sitting there has an equal right to speak and to vote on these meetings. So again, during the meetings themselves, it is critical that you treat everybody with mutual respect. And again, in my book, that means preparing ahead of time for those meetings. It means listening to what other people are saying and then working toward a consensus. And then once that consensus has been reached and you've made a decision, act as a single voice, act as a single body. Martin Luther King's idea of unity never meant uniformity. It's okay to disagree with your other council members and even the mayor. But once a decision has been made, your commitment should be to then executing that decision on behalf of the entire council. Let it go. Move forward as a group. That's where the real power is in governing local communities. When you allow yourself to be split up, when you can't walk out of the meeting with mutual respect, you've broken that power, and your community is going to struggle with whatever it is you're trying to get done. So when you've reached a decision, do your best to then execute it and to act as a group on that whole matter. Now, when you are making decisions, typically, again, according to Robert's Rules of Order or really any other protocol out there, the way that this works is that a council member makes a motion, and it can be done after the mayor has invited that motion, and all motions need to be made and seconded before you can have a conversation about that issue. In other words, as a topic gets introduced, it should start with perhaps a brief introduction to the topic, but then we should be talking about a specific action step that we're going to take. And as soon as you've got to the point where, okay, this is the action that we need to be considering, make a motion that we approve that particular action, wait for somebody else to second that, and then the mayor should repeat that motion, identify who seconded the motion, and call for discussion. That's when you get to all talk about that particular decision. If someone wants to change the direction or amend it, you've got to amend that motion. And that'll require that both the person that made the motion and the person that seconded it to make that amendment to the motion. And then you're talking about it, just the amendment. Keep your conversation and your decisions targeted to those things by making motions. And once a motion's been made, that's all you get to talk about, that particular topic. Anything outside of that topic would be off the agenda, and your presiding officer should be reminding people, let's keep our conversations on task here. And then the mayor is the one that calls for a vote and asks for you to either vote yes or no, or aye or nay, whatever form you want to take here. But thumbs up, thumbs down, ask the clerk for a roll call. And yes, in these instances, mayors vote. There's a misconception by some mayors that they should only be exercising a veto, and that's not true. You are a full-fledged member of the council when it comes to voting, and so you should be voting as a mayor, and then once everyone has voted, you should announce the results of that vote. And it is okay for it to be 3-2 or 4-1 or 5-0. Mayors should not be abstaining from votes just because it's clear that the motion has already passed. Their support or lack of support should be recorded on the record. And so I encourage mayors to vote on every motion that gets made. You can shorten your agenda items somewhat through a trick called a consent agenda. What this is that you pile onto one vote several items, and typically these are the non-controversial, run-of-the-mill routine items that don't require any further discussion. And you can put them all into one thing and say everything that's on the consent agenda we hereby approve, all in favor, aye, nay. You then can move on to your agenda without having to go through those individually. And so you can put, for example, on your agenda several items like approving minutes or receiving reports that don't take any further action, or even paying the bills or paying most of the bills. Approving contracts, the run-of-the-mill stuff that isn't controversial, that doesn't require a conversation, I would say dispense with it with a consent agenda. Keep your meetings short. You don't need to have 14 votes just so that you can fill up an hour. If you have things that are not going to take any thought, anything other than, we've already looked at these in our finance committee meetings. We're already prepared for this. We know what's in there. We're not going to have any further discussion. Let's put those into the consent agenda. The presiding officer can ask for a motion to approve that consent agenda, just like any other topic on it. And if it's approved, you move on. With that said, one of the other tricks that you can do, even if something is already in the consent agenda, one of the things that council members can do is just simply ask, I want to remove this particular thing from the consent agenda. That lets everybody know you've got something to say about that one item, or maybe it's a couple of items, but everything else you're good with. And so that even works if you're paying the bills and approving all the warrants, for example. You can pull just one or two or three of those warrants out of the consent agenda. That creates a separate item immediately after the consent agenda, and you can address that one item subsequently without having to disrupt the rest of the meeting. It keeps your meetings short. One of the things that you will be passing a lot of are ordinances, and I would encourage you to work with your legal counsel on this. Typically, every municipality has legal counsel in place, and they've got a form of an ordinance that they're comfortable with, and you can talk to them about this. You should expect that it meets the state statute requirements, and that includes that every ordinance be read 3 times. That every ordinance have these parts in it, because the statute requires that it be signed, attested, and recorded. And what they're looking for is these particular parts in every ordinance. It's got to have a title. And many times when you read an ordinance, you just read the title, and typically it's, an ordinance of the town of blank, establishing whatever, and typically you're changing an old ordinance, so maybe you're modifying or amending or repealing whatever that old ordinance is. They all start with that same language, be it ordained. That's what makes this an ordinance, by the governing body, that's you. And then the body can have, whatever the detailed provisions are. You also want to say whenever you pass an ordinance that anything that conflicts with this in the past, any old ordinances that conflict with this are hereby repealed. And that's one of the reasons why you want to identify what those repealed ordinances are, so that if anyone's got to do legal research, they can do that. You want to have an effective date for your ordinance, and typically it's upon publication or some particular date. If you're doing this fast forward, you want it to take effect with the next fiscal year. And if there's a penalty for violating that ordinance, what's the penalty for it? Many municipal ordinances do carry a penalty clause and a fine of $750, for example. Those are the main parts of the ordinance. You can put whatever you want topically into the body of those ordinances. And again, I would encourage you to work with your local attorney to make sure that these things cover the ordinance requirements that they have in place. Most ordinances do need to be read 3 times on different dates. There's an exception to that rule, and it's an emergency ordinance. And sometimes these, even though they're called an emergency ordinance, I can guarantee you can plan on these happening. One, for example, that happens on a regular basis, I saw it happen at the city of Douglas, is an emergency ordinance that included the annual budget. And the reason that it was passed on an emergency basis is because it wasn't possible to read it 3 times and get it passed prior to the state deadline for getting these things submitted, because there wasn't enough time between the public hearing and the date that you've got to have this thing approved. And so typically what happens is you have your public hearing, and then by law, within 24 hours, you've got to pass the budget. And so you dispense with reading it 3 times. You declare the emergency simply to be that there's no time between the public hearing and the statutory deadline. And so by law, we're required to pass this by an emergency ordinance. It takes a supermajority vote to do that, but typically when you're talking about something like a budget, it's something that you've already put a lot of time and thought into, and so you can get these things done and make them effective as soon as you want thereafter. As soon as they've been published or posted, they get signed and attested and recorded just like any other ordinary ordinance. It's just that you're able to speed them up and get them done much faster if you truly have an emergency. And yes, the short-sightedness of state statutes is definitely one of those emergencies that qualifies. The other kind of ordinance that's out there is your charter ordinance. You can actually go back and change your charter ordinance, much like you could amend the Constitution. Sheridan, for example, went through this looking to pass a charter ordinance to put themselves in a position where they would be professionally managed by a city administrator. So you can do these in the same way. They do require a 2/3 majority of the elected leaders to get passed. They do require publication and some additional timing requirements. Charter ordinances, because they are formational documents, also get filed. These are one of the few ordinances that you do need to file with the Wyoming Secretary of State. And so you can only change them with another charter ordinance. And again, think of this as like your own municipal constitution. The last kind of thing that you can pass are resolutions. These do not have the full effect of law. These are simply resolutions that express an opinion, or maybe you use them to adopt a new employee personnel policy, or whatever you are looking to do as far as your council votes. So they don't have the same power as an ordinance, and so you don't have to publish them and go through the same lengthy process to get ordinances on the book, but they can still have a big effect to your community. Lots of communities do pass resolutions either to recognize some worthy individual or some effort or some day, or, as I said, to adopt a policy. And if that's a policy that has public support, for example, maybe you want to pass one that specifically changes your workplace harassment guidelines. You can do that through a resolution. All of these types of laws and all of the actions that you take are governed, again, by that Title 16 of the state statutes, and in particular, Article 4, which is where you'll find the Public Meetings Law, or the Wyoming Open Meetings Law. And basically, what that says is that anytime you want to take action, you've got to do so in a public meeting, and all of your meetings are open to the public. Specifically, what they say is that anytime there's a quorum of a governing body called by the proper authority for the purpose of making decisions, that makes it a public meeting. All of those meetings are to be open to the public. And I would encourage you, when in doubt, conduct the meeting in public. That is the maximum amount of the public's business that you can do in public is exactly what you should be doing. And so when you've got a public meeting, the public is allowed to attend that. Now, they're not required to tell you who they are to attend. If they want to speak, they must identify themselves. And this is where I think it's very helpful to have them identify their affiliation, or if you're talking about a zoning change, to ask them, do you live in this neighborhood? Is this something that affects you? Otherwise, you're not allowed to screen them out or to keep them out of the meeting. In fact, you need to recognize that they're there and have a right to be there, even if it's not a public comment period. They're allowed to sit there and simply observe their community being governed. They can be recognized at any time through the presiding officer, and I would encourage you to do that only when your agenda invites that. And one of the changes that we've seen with legislative matters over the last couple of years is, rather than keep the public waiting until the end of their meeting for public comment, through management council's action, they now require every committee to accept comment on each issue before the committee moves on to another issue. That's been a good policy, and it might be one that you want to consider for your own council, that you have public comment at the end of the meeting, but you also, through the presiding officer, invite public comment as you move through the agenda, where it's appropriate to do so. When you've got to have a public hearing, recognize that that's not the same thing as a city council meeting. And so you literally, if you're going to do a public hearing while you're there as city council, you need to close your regular meeting and open the public hearing. And it's at that point during your public hearing that the public gets to talk, not council members. You can ask clarifying questions, but for the most part, we should only be hearing from the presiding officer as he calls upon members of the public to share their thoughts. This is not the time to debate. This is not the time to say what you think or what you feel. It is okay, especially if you're in a crowded room, for the mayor or whoever the presiding officer is to limit the public conversation to a few minutes. Time limits are permissible in those circumstances so that you can hear from as many people as possible. And I think it's also okay as a presiding officer to let people know, hey, if you just want to say ditto, that's okay. You don't have to repeat word for word what the previous person said. We'll simply note that you fully support what that comment may have been. When you're done with those meetings, you need to publish the the minutes of that meeting. If you are doing your meetings correctly, you always record minutes. I would encourage you to record your minutes in a way that works for you. And what many councils have found is that there's a balancing act here. How much do we put into our minutes? How much do we not? You only are required to put in anything that required action of the council. You don't have to put all of the conversations in the minutes as far as what you're publishing. You do not have to do that. And so you do need to record minutes in the sense that any official acts need to be included, but beyond that, you don't have to include anything. And so if you're looking to save money on public notices, that's one place to do that. At the same time, understand that the more accountability that you allow, the more transparency that you allow, the more likely it is that you're going to have trust with the public. And so understand, by law, there are certain things that need to be published. If you're going to have a meeting, you've got to post that ahead of time. Publishing meetings is helpful, but if you've got a weekly newspaper and you need to hold an emergency meeting, call your newspaper and let them know, Joe, tomorrow we're going to have a meeting at 5 o'clock. Give them 24-hour notice, but you don't have to wait for the next newspaper to come out to hold a meeting. Let them know somehow that meeting is going to be taking place, what's going to be on the agenda or what's going to be considered for adoption at that time, and that's all you really got to do here. You don't have to provide much more than that. For any action to be a legitimate action of council, it must happen at a public meeting. Any action that you take outside of a public meeting is null and void. What that means is it's as though you never took action. So if you try to hide something, or if you accidentally hold a public meeting without it being published, without following all of the rules, without allowing the public to be there, you've broken the rules, and whatever it is you just approved is undone. It is as though that contract was never signed, as though that ordinance was never passed. It is completely null and void on the spot. Not voidable where somebody challenged it, but literally, as of that moment, whatever decision you just made is broken. It is ineffective. You must, if you're going to take any action whatsoever, you must do it at a public meeting. And if you've got a group of your council meeting that's together because the mayor called them together and there's a quorum, that makes it a public meeting. There aren't any exceptions to that except for executive sessions. Okay, if you've got a quorum present and you're talking about community business and you came together for that purpose to talk about a community business, that makes it a public meeting. It needs to have notice. You need to allow the public in there. And that includes things like planning sessions, work sessions, retreats to talk about your strategic plan, a presentation from folks that want to talk to you about, whether they can get a right of way for fiber optics. You need to hold those kinds of decision-making meetings publicly. And so as a public meeting, the Wyoming Open Meetings Law requires that every meeting be preceded by public notice, preferably one that's been published, and treated as any other meeting. And that includes special meetings. You need to let people know what you're doing. Now, some people take this to an extreme and they say, well, wait a minute, I'm in a small town. If all 5 of us show up and watch my kid's volleyball game, we're going to get in trouble. No, that's not true. And that's because that's not a meeting called by the mayor, by proper authority, for any kind of a purpose of conducting public business. You're getting together to watch a volleyball game. It doesn't matter if you guys want to go out and celebrate Aunt Edna's birthday together at the local restaurant. That doesn't make it a meeting just because the 5 of you or any 3 of you are there, or even if you all ride to the WAM convention together in the same vehicle. That doesn't make it a meeting. The only time you need to worry about it is if you're talking about the business of the community. And if for example, the mayor says, let's talk about this new fiber optics route while we're heading down to the WAM convention, and let's talk about it in the car, that's a no-no, because you're taking official business decisions with you in a place where you can't accommodate the public, and you probably didn't publish that you were going to be doing that. So anytime that you get together, and even if you try to do this sneakily, I'll send you an email and then you chain it together and send an email to the next council member. Don't do that. Don't try to sneak around and hide the stuff. If you're talking about council business, get it out in the open. Don't talk about it in cars or in the bar room at the WAM convention. Make sure that you're doing these things appropriately. And if you do need to talk privately, like in an executive session, you need to know that's allowed only under very specific list of exceptions. I mean, you really do want to look at this statute. In fact, I would encourage you to tape this statute to the front of your desk in your council meeting. Anytime you want to go into executive session, you need to specifically identify why. And the reason needs to be on that list of 16.4.405. That statute lists things like considering employment, litigation, national security, real estate purchases. Those things that are specifically listed, yeah, you can go into executive session to discuss them. But that's it. And so when you go to executive session, you should make a motion to go into executive session, identify which of these reasons you're going into executive session for, and then pass a motion on that. And then once you're in that executive session, assuming that there was a motion and a second and an approval for that, you should state what the reason is. The statutory purpose of that meeting should be identified, and you should not take any actions whatsoever. Remember, you can talk about these things privately, but if you're going to take an action, you got to do that out there in the public meeting. So adjourn your executive session, go back out into the public meeting, and then take action. You got to take minutes here. You got to record what was done. I would say fewer the better. You definitely want to have enough in your minutes that identifies what that statutory purpose was, but beyond that, you're not taking any official action. And so I wouldn't record much more than that. Maybe just simply the time that was taken while you discussed these things. So just make sure that if you go into executive session, you've got a statutory purpose that allows it. If you don't, there's real consequences here. The only valid decisions that you can make, the only valid actions that you can take must be in a public meeting that complies with the Wyoming Open Meetings Law. Otherwise, they're null and void. They're as if they never happened. And if you did get involved with violating that act, it is a crime. You can be charged with a misdemeanor as a council member, and if found guilty, you can be assessed a fine of up to $750. Likewise, the flip side of this is if there's a legitimate purpose for your executive session, keep it that way. Do not share outside of that executive session anything that you may have learned in that executive session. That too violates the Ethics and Disclosure Act. It violates the law. So be very careful with these. If you need to have executive session, make sure it falls within the statute. Understand that if you want to take any action, you got to do it publicly, according to the Wyoming Open Meetings Law. So I finished up those last few slides rather quickly. We do still have a few minutes left. I will ask Justin if you would maybe guide us to some specific questions for the time that we have remaining.
Sure, Joe. We had one earlier from Kathy. Um, there's an issue in her particular town with the street being too small, so vehicles park on the sidewalk, which I'm assuming probably is leading to the degradation of the sidewalk and or impeding pedestrians. How to resolve this? How to make sure we are addressing the public's needs?
So I would start with a review of that statute and maybe more broadly, that ordinance, and maybe more broadly, the requirement that homeowners and property owners have to maintain the full right-of-way for most communities. Written right into your ordinance about those rights-of-way will be responsibilities for folks to, for example, shovel snow off of their sidewalk, and to do so without impeding travel on the right-of-way. And so look to see what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and that might be something that you need to revisit, that maybe you need to make it specific that people are not allowed to park on sidewalks, that they need to either park on the road surface or get completely off of the road with a driveway of some sort. You might also look at whatever your nuisance and abatement ordinances apply in this area, because oftentimes, especially vehicles that have been parked for a certain period of time, are covered in your nuisance abatement ordinance. And so you might have a couple of different directions that you can come from to address it. If it's a community-wide problem, the other thing that I would do is maybe try to start some public discourse about it. Is this just one neighborhood? Is it just one dangerous intersection? Should we approach this as a community-wide concern about public safety? Because oftentimes that is what we're talking about. You need to be able to safely walk on sidewalks as well as drive in the roads. And so you've got a couple, three different directions to approach this by, and depending on what you find by looking at those ordinances, you might decide, which department you're going to see take the lead here, whether it's law enforcement or public works, or even maybe you're planning and zoning folks looking at this from a nuisance abatement perspective. So it depends on what your ordinances say.
Okay. If anybody else has any questions during this Q&A period, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask those questions, feel free. I don't have anything else in the chat. Any other questions for Joe? All right, Joe, I don't see anything further for you on this particular bit of subject matter. So if you guys do have any questions in this week in between sessions, Joe will be back with us next week. You can feel free to bring those to that particular meeting, or if you want to email them to me in the interim, I'm more than happy to pass those along to Joe so that we can get those answers back to you as well. As I mentioned too, we'll record or are recording all of these sessions for your reference. So if you want to go back, there's part of it that you missed. And of course, for the folks that weren't able to make it, like most of municipal elected officials, most people, a lot of people have full-time jobs. It's hard to break away for an afternoon. We understand that. So we wanted to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to take a look at this. So anyway, with that, thank you so much, Joe. I'm going to transition to the WAM presentation here real quick, and appreciate your presentation today.
Well, thank you all, everyone. And as Justin said, if you have any questions, forward them to him or to me, and we'll get them answered however we can.
And as we go week by week too, I will email out the PDFs of Joe's presentations as well, so that you guys can reference back to those. He's got some really great information on those, and trying to cram this much information even into a couple hours is pretty tricky. So with that, so I wanted to go ahead and take a few minutes. obviously when you jump into public service and working in giving of your time to your community, you knew you were getting into that. What you may or may not have understood is as a WAM member community, you're also getting into WAM. So I wanted to take a little bit of an opportunity to introduce you to the organization, what we are, who we are, what we do for your community. This is our main page website. So WYOMUNI, so wyomuni.org is our website. You may or may not have had a chance to take a look here, but I wanted to show you a few of the tools that can be of a lot of use to you. Probably the first and foremost, this guy here where it says Mayor Council Handbook. If you click the download queue on that, that's going to bring up a PDF, which is printable, or you can obviously peruse it electronically if you don't want to burn the paper. This is available obviously free of charge off of the website. We go through this handbook as it explains when statutes change at the state level, when they change statutes that affect any of the laws that are noted in this handbook. We go ahead and make revisions to that to make sure that you're up to date and you're not dealing with old information that's erroneous at that point. A lot of the statutes, or almost all of the statutes that Joe talked about in his presentation are covered here in the handbook too. And we've got it split up in some pretty useful categories. Wyoming Municipal Corporations, which talks about your formations of city and town government, all of the basic formative law and statute that goes into that. Incorporation, corporate powers, annexation, exclusion of land annexation of cities and towns, and dissolution. Office of the mayor, and then office of council member. Those are great ones to look at. Talks about all the different ins and outs statutorily about those particular positions. A lot of the stuff Joe covered as far as responsibilities and whatnot of those positions, but also some of the other smaller idiosyncrasies. So say vacancies. I get that call a lot when there's a kind of an unexpected vacancy on a council. Maybe they had, maybe they, God forbid, they had a death on the council, or they have a resignation, which does sometimes happen. Maybe somebody's got to move, their job's taking them away from the community, those kinds of things. So that goes over the vacancies on the council, how you would fill those following statute by appointment sometimes, and if it's in between periods, and then how to get somebody actually technically elected to that position. Meetings of the governing body. Again, that's going to cover open meetings law, the legalities behind posting for meetings, how much notice you have to give to the public, orders of business agendas. Also goes over the duties of the mayor and duties of the clerk, treasurer, or clerk. So that's a good one, just to understand a little bit the ins and outs of normal meetings and how they go. Ordinances and charter ordinances, talks a little bit about your lawmaking abilities, basically, as a municipal body. Alternative forms of government. This one right now, nobody in the state has a commission style government. Everybody is either mayor, council, or manager, city manager style. So some interesting to read up on those different forms of government. Nominations, elections, initiative and referendum and recall. That talks about obviously your different election forms. Interestingly enough, there's under the recall portion, there's actually a bill in the legislature right now that would create a recall provision in statute for municipal officials, for members of the public to be able to recall those folks. So again, these are always kind of living documents. Things change pretty quickly. City and town finance. Again, we're going to go over a lot of that information over the next few weeks, but a good section to get to know. Financial administration, budgeting, auditing, purchasing, local improvements, public improvements, planning, obviously zoning. Those kinds of things are huge huge issues in front of every city or town council, and can be some of your most contentious issues depending on what zoning choices or what decisions are in front of you. Sometimes those can be, they can be the kind of things that really worry people if you're moving, say, a business unit near into residential or those kinds of things. So something to keep to have your mind around, because that will come up. Other services provided by city and town government. So it talks about police and fire, civil service, pensions and retirement, health and sanitation, entertainment, band, concerts, libraries, museums, parks, recreation. And then down here, cooperation with other units of government. The Wyoming Administrative Procedure Act is pretty unique to Wyoming. Good information to know about cooperative stuff with other governments. I'll go back to the main webpage. If you haven't had a chance yet, these videos down here, these were produced a couple years ago, just prior to when I joined WAM. These are kind of they're little bite-sized videos. Most of them only run 5 to 8 minutes a piece, but they're on kind of some of these key tenets of municipal government. So basic responsibilities of the governing body, ethics and conflicts of interest, fundamentals of municipal budgeting, open meetings law, legal framework of municipal government, guidelines for the conduct of elected officials. That's a good one. Andy Somerville, she was the mayor in Laramie at the time. She's a council person again. And then Public Records Act. This one here is one that we added last year. This is on blockchain technology. They actually invited an attorney who was on the governor's blockchain task force to come in and kind of explain blockchain technology. Obviously, that's been something that's thrown around the legislature quite a bit, something that Wyoming actually has some kind of actually world leading regulation things and whatnot in place, some banking things that they've approached that nowhere else in the world has. So those are we did that as kind of an explainer, because everybody was just getting hammered with blockchain all the time, and just kind of understanding if you were going to have blockchain businesses deciding to come to your community, what that actually meant. So the association, there have been municipal organizations in Wyoming basically since the late 20s. Some of those have coalesced. The Wyoming Association of Municipalities, as it stands now, was incorporated in 1967. We're a nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, and we represent 98 of the 99 cities and towns in Wyoming. Rock Springs is the only community that's not currently a member of our organization. 70% of the state's population lives in a city or town. So when we go to talk to the legislature on your behalf, we point that out an awful lot, because 70% live within your corporate boundaries. 100% of Wyoming's 100% of Wyoming's people use your services at some point or another. They've got to come into town for fuel, for food, for entertainment. So they all end up using your streets, your police, your protection, your public sanitation, all the things that go along with that. So we do represent a lot of the people in the state. We do have a board of directors. It's composed of mayors, council members, some staff, representative from the Great Open Spaces City Managers Association, or GOSMA. You'll hear that term sometimes. That one's so the 3 city managers, and then the numerous administrators from around the state. I think pretty much all belong to that. Representative from the Wyoming Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers, WAMCAT. Not only do they have a really cool superhero name, but it's actually an incredible organization. WAMCAT's very, very helpful to our mission as far as getting information out. Like Joe mentioned, in a lot of communities, the clerk treasurer is pretty much the CEO of the community from a day in, day out basis. While most council people and even the mayor may not be engaged on a daily basis, that clerk treasurer is. They're the ones facing the public, taking utility bills, dealing with day-to-day business things, and they tend to be heavy lifters and are amazingly good at their job. So we do a lot of work with them. And then we also have a representative from our Leadership Training Services Committee. We actually have a subcommittee that works on training initiatives and what we want to put on our training agendas. Our objectives are so we're basically a three-legged stool to advocate for Wyoming cities and towns' municipal interests regarding both state and federal legislation. What does that mean? Well, we're lobbyists. We're a 4-person staff. And I'll introduce you to the folks from our staff here just below. But a lot of what we do is at the legislature. Obviously, right now we're in the midst of an 8-day virtual session. This year's session is incredibly unique, obviously mostly due to COVID and how they've had to chop it up. They convened for a day, gavelled out. They did some committee meetings last week. This week they started an 8-day virtual. That'll carry into next week, and then they'll gavel out again, and it sounds like they won't come back until the beginning of March or maybe even later, just depending on how health things are going. It's about 50-50 right now. If you watch any of those meetings on YouTube, about half of them are at home and about half of them are in the chambers, but they're all on Zoom. So provide training opportunities to municipal officials and staff through the local government leadership program, which assists Wyoming communities with fundamental training. This boot camp is obviously a part of that training initiative. Again, we've done newly elected events in the past, but not this intensive where it was this much information kind of right off the bat. But since I joined WAM a couple years ago, I saw the need to try to facilitate something like this where newly elected officials could, I hate to say hit you with a fire hose a little bit, but hit you with the fire hose a little bit and try to give you as much information up front as possible. These classes that Joe's teaching over these next 6 weeks basically would be classes that we would offer normally at our winter conference and summer convention. To take all these classes one at a time, it would take you coming to both events for a couple years to get through all these classes and get all this information. So hopefully by boiling it down and condensing it a little bit, give you a little bit better information, a little quicker delivery of that information, so it doesn't take you so long to have been in front of it. Communication, all things related to municipal governments, training, outreach, and advocacy. Contact WAM to discover all the ways it keeps members and stakeholders informed. As the only municipal association in the state since the late 60s, when people have information that they want us to carry to you or that they want to get out to the cities and towns in Wyoming, we're the ones that they disperse it to generally. So you'll see a lot of emails that come from us, different communications that we send out that'll talk about grant opportunities or training opportunities or any of these different things that, again, these other organizations would like you to know about. They generally bring it to us because they know that we're sort of a single conduit out to. Staff-wise, as I mentioned, we're 4 people on staff. We got 3 bios here. Dave Frazier is our executive director. Dave's been with us, I think, going on 2 years, just about exactly 2 years now. He ends up doing a lot of he's involved pretty heavily in the advocacy portion of it. He's out at our meetings. We had a Region 2 meeting up in the northeast corner today that was facilitated by the city of Gillette that he appeared on and gave a legislative update. So Dave's the executive director. Erla, who's I think on here still, Erla takes care of everything around here, including taking care of Dave and I. She's our finance manager as well as our HR director. She also is the main administrator of WAM JPIC, which is our it's a health insurance product that we provide that's available for the cities and towns especially for the communities that are too small to kind of have the buying power for reasonable health insurance. There I am. Again, I'm member services manager, so that's a little bit of a catch-all title. I handle communications. I help out with the legislative advocacy and lobbying efforts. you'll see a lot of stuff that comes through from me, especially during the legislative session, call to action emails, those kinds of things. WAM's strength is in our numbers and in our political in our collective political clout. Right now, you'll see in the news, or you may have seen some of my emails if you're already in our database, but right now, Senate File 64 has been a big one that we've done some calls to action. That one actually is a bill to cut what they call direct distribution to all of your communities. There's some history of that. I'll show you another publication here just in a second that talks about it's a finance report that was done a couple years ago, but there's some really good history in there about the history of direct distribution. The last several bienniums, that's been $105 million pot of money that's been split up of a really complex formula that they forced that through called the Madden formula. It takes a bunch of different different categories basically into consideration. It's not just per capita, and it divvies out the monies accordingly. They're looking at a 10% cut is where that bill stands now. We had it temporarily cut down to a 5% cut, and then the Senate put it back up to a 10% cut. So the legislative session is always an incredibly interesting adventure for us, and obviously a little bit of a roller coaster ride. We tend to soak up most of those bumps because we're there all day, every day as it's going on. But we definitely do rally the troops, especially when bills are kind of at critical votes and those kinds of things. You'll see call to action emails, and we're just asking you to contact your representative or senator for your particular city or town for your district, and let them know, how you might be affected by that particular bill. So our board of directors, so WAM is split up into 6 regions. I wish I had an easier way to get to the map of it, but I don't here on the website. So region 1 is basically the southeast corner. So from Laramie over to Cheyenne, all the way to the Nebraska border, and then north to about Lingle and Torrington. Region 2 is the northeast corner. It's a fairly big region. It goes from Douglas on the very south end all the way up to the Montana and South Dakota lines. Region 3 is the northwest corner, so butting up against Yellowstone, across to obviously the Montana line, and then down across from, say, Worland, and going across to Ten Sleep. Region 4 is right smack dab in the middle of the state. So you've got Casper, Evansville Mills, Barnum, and then on over to like Riverton, Lander, Pavilion, and then up to Shoshone, and and then Region 5, another big region. That one goes from Evanston all the way up to Jackson on the west edge of the state, and then Region 6 runs along the very bottom of the state from Rock Springs over to Saratoga. Rock Springs, Green River over to Saratoga. So our president is Matt Hall. He's the mayor of Cody. Our vice president is Carter Napier. He's the city manager of Casper. Our WAMCAT representative, Kathy Lynn, she's our clerk treasurer out of Sundance. And then Gosma representative, so Carter just got named as vice president. So they'll probably have a new Gosma representative, but they haven't decided on who they're going to bring into that. Scott Madsen, who's a council member in Buffalo, is our Leadership Training Services Committee chair. And then our 2 past presidents have been presidents of the organization that passed. They're still in elected office. So Susan Juska out of Glendale, and then Mayor Paul Brooks from Sundance. Resources, wanted to show you a couple quick things here. That Mayor Council Handbook is here as well as on the front page. Budget Prep Handbook, we put one of these out each year. This comes out prior to budget time. We collect a bunch of information from the state and put it in a one-stop shop source for your use as you're producing your budgets each year. Municipal Finance Report, volumes 1 and 2. Again, these were produced in 2016, 2017. There's been some talk about us diving back into that particular information or into that back into that category to produce maybe a volume 3 as things have changed. But this is good. Both of those have some great information about funding mechanisms, revenue sources. It talks about direct distribution, your community's relationships with the state, as far as the monies that pass through the state government and are, then reapportioned back down to the municipal governments. Wyoming's local governments, city and town governments, county governments actually have the least amount of financial freedom of any local governments in the United States. We're dead last. Alaska comes next. More of our money comes through the state and back to us, basically, than any other state, and we have the least amount of taxing authority. So it's a weird dynamic, and you'll learn more about it as things go along. And sometimes it feels like we're woefully out of control of the things that we do, but that's okay. We're working on it. One other thing that I did want to bring up, if you're interested, again, with our advocacy, we try, as I stated before, we try to soak up the speed bumps of the day-to-day when it comes to, the twists and turns of the legislature. We have legislation that honestly we oppose, and then we like it, and then we oppose it sometimes in the course of the same day, just depending on how things get amended and then how they would affect our members. So a lot of times when things come out at the very end of the session, or maybe you read about them in the newspaper, or as an old boss of mine, he says, show me the baby, don't tell me about the labor. That's kind of what we try to provide for all of you, is to get good results at the legislature and hopefully keep the heartache and the stress out of it for you. Legislative season preview. This talks about some of the stuff that was done in the interim session. So for any of you that are not real familiar with how Wyoming's legislature works, they have 2 different sessions. We're technically in the long session this year. The short session every other year is the budget session, where basically they're really supposed to, the focus is supposed to be on the budget bill. Anything that they introduce that's not the budget bill has to pass by 2/3 to even get introduced. So most of the extraneous stuff gets weeded out pretty quickly, and they end up looking at a smaller slate of bills. During this long session, it's a lot of bills they introduce. It'll be interesting to see how it works out this time, but I mean, we've had as many as 500 bills and plus out of the House and the Senate. So it's a lot to keep track of. Obviously, not all those bills have anything to do with municipalities or any negative or positive effect in municipalities, but we do a lot of sorting through them and a lot of bill reading and those kinds of things to make sure that they don't. This legislative tracking database, again, this is under the advocacy tab and follow legislation. Down here at the bottom, there's a great YouTube tutorial here on how to use it. That talks about how to run through it. But basically, when you get down here, we've got House bills. So these are all the current House bills that we're tracking. I think they're up to almost 100 House bills now already that have been introduced. So you'll notice this color coding. If it's red, that's a bill that we're currently in opposition of. If it's blue, it's a bill that we're actually supporting. Green is monitor. So that means that there's a potential that it's something that we may have to jump in on. But we're just keeping an eye on it as it goes throughout the process. Now, these decisions, as far as where we're at, oppose, support, or monitor on these bills, are ran through what we call a legislative leadership committee. We have a committee that's made up of representatives from all 6 of those WAM regions. They meet during the session, we meet every Thursday morning at 7 in the morning. When things are really cooking during the session, sometimes we might meet every morning. And then in the off season, the interim season, it's generally just a monthly meeting. But as we're going through, we'll give them updates on what these bills did in the preceding week, or like I say, when things are really going hot and heavy, we may even meet every day. We'll give them updates if amendments were added. And then they vote as to what our direction is on those particular bills. So It's an interesting process. We don't make any of those decisions on our own. We take that direction again from membership. And then, so this tool is really kind of nice too. This brighter green tab that you see here. So like today, this particular bill, which is industrial siding revisions bill, passed on third reading. The vote was 56-4. So that bill now travel to the Senate next Monday. They'll start on that one in the Senate. So that one's one that we're monitoring right now. It neither helps or hurts us, but it could potentially, depending on how it may get amended. So local government distributions. This is one that talks about the direct distribution. Again, there's a mirror Senate bill that we don't like currently. This House bill hasn't even been introduced. So it's something that we support it in the form that it's in, but once it starts along its journey in the House, if they may just take up the Senate bill and then this one will die. So, but anyway, so that goes through. You can do the same thing in the Senate's tab. You can click the Senate bills, or if you just want to see, that shows you all the bills we support in both the Senate and the House. You can also do that with the opposed. So that's the opposed list is always longer because some of the support bills obviously are ones that we've sought. It's legislation that we do legislative resolutions at our summer convention, wherein as we solicit resolutions from all of your communities ahead of time. Those resolutions get passed by the individual city councils under that resolutions process that Joe described. They come to us, they go through a committee where they sometimes will have very similar resolutions on the same subject, so they'll combine them and do those sorts of things. And then the body as a whole, we have a big membership meeting where everybody that's there at summer convention representing all the communities goes ahead and votes on those resolutions, whether they want us to kind of have those be our legislative marching orders for the year. So, and then any of these bills too, I didn't click on that for you. So say you want to see the actual text of this bill, you click on the bill number there at the left side of that tab, and it takes you to the, this is a window into the Legislative Service Office website, and it shows you the actual text of the bill. You get the digest on it, so what it's done so far. It'll talk about where it's at in process, scheduled committee meetings, last action. It's just received for introduction. So far it hasn't been put through. And then most bills, unless it's something on a brand new, something that's on a brand new subject, a lot of times they're modifying existing state statutes. So that's when you'll see this, where you've got these crossouts basically. So this is existing state statute, and they're looking to, strike those parts of it, replace it with this red language that would, this one happens to be bond elections. The reason it would severely restrict when we could hold bond elections. It's pretty strong breach of and sort of preemption of local control, which as a rule with WAM and again at the direction of our board and of the membership, anything that the state does that's a preemption of your local control, we tend to stand in pretty firm opposition of. So with that, again, I just wanted to give you guys a quick tour around our website. Those are some tools that you can that I think you could use pretty readily and fairly often. Most of your city halls, town halls should have a copy or two of that mayor council handbook. But again, this electronic version that's on the website is the most recent and has the most recent information. So most definitely take advantage of that if you have questions. A lot of times procedural things, I've been in this job for a couple of years now. I try to soak it up as quick as I can, but I get phone calls at least a couple of months where it's something new to me, and figuring out the state statute part of it and making sure that we're giving good advice is always an interesting learning experience. But it's amazing how much information is in that mayor council handbook. So please do take advantage of it. Does anybody have any questions? I didn't see anything in the chat question-wise, so we're a few minutes early, but I think that's okay. I appreciate everybody for sticking it out. I know it's a long stretch on Zoom, but I hope you got some good information out of this first session. We'll convene again next Friday, same time. I'll send the link out. Send the link out with obviously the agenda is already out there, so but I'll send out the link for the next meeting early next week, along with the link to this video, so as well as Joe's PDF too. So I'll have that all in one package for you, so you'll be able to look back and review any of this information from this week, and then have the link for next week's meeting. So again, I thank everybody so much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week.